Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah.
You know how this works. We pick a topic, we grab some fascinating sources, and we really get into it. And today we're tackling something pretty heavy, terrorism, war, and secularism.
Big topics, for sure.
Yeah, but also super relevant.
Yeah,
You can't really escape these issues. They're always in the headlines in one way or another.
absolutely. And to help us unpack all of this, we've got two main sources we're diving into. First, we've got Yuval Noah Harari's book, Sapiens,
Yeah.
which, if you haven't read it yet, it's like this mind-blowing exploration of human history. And then we're also looking at this really insightful article from the World Economic Forum. It's called How Terrorists Fund Their Attacks and How to Stop Them. So yeah, we're going to be going deep on this stuff.
Okay, so let's jump right in. And so I think one of the first things that struck me when reading through these sources was how terrorism really plays on fear.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's this language used in the article that just like grabs you, talking about attacks that suddenly happen, being unpredictable.
Causing emotional shock.
It's all designed to tap into our deepest anxieties.
And it works, doesn't it? Like,
Yeah.
you can't help but feel that jolt of anxiety when you hear about another attack. But then Harari in Sapiens, he kind of throws this curveball. He points out that statistically, you're far more likely to die from a car accident, diabetes, or even air pollution than a terrorist attack.
It's true. The numbers are startling.
Yeah, so why does terrorism have this outsized impact on us? Why does it grip us with such fear when other statistically more likely threats don't?
Well, because terrorists, they're masters of psychology. They understand how to exploit our emotional vulnerabilities. They know that a car crash, even though tragic, is often seen as this random event.
Hmm.
But terrorism, it feels deliberate. It feels targeted. It makes us question our safety in this much deeper existential way.
It makes you feel powerless.
Exactly.
Harari uses this brilliant analogy to explain this dynamic. He compares terrorists to a fly buzzing around a china shop.
Love that analogy.
On their own, they can't do much damage.
Yeah.
But if they can get a bull, which represents public fear in this case, riled up enough, the whole shop gets smashed. So the terrorists are public fear is the bull and the china shop. That's our political landscape and our sense of security.
And what's really interesting is that modern states have actually become incredibly good at reducing large-scale violence. We're living in a relatively peaceful time, historically speaking, but that success almost creates this vacuum
Oh, that's fascinating.
where even small acts of terrorism seem incredibly disruptive.
Like we've become victims of our own success in a way. The safer we get, the more sensitive we become to even the smallest threats.
Exactly. So it begs the question, how do we break free from this cycle of fear that terrorists exploit?
Right. Because if we overreact, if we let fear dictate our actions, aren't we just playing into their hands?
We are. It's about recognizing the opportunity cost of our fear.
Right.
Think about the war on terror and the sheer amount of resources poured into it. What if those resources had been directed towards other global challenges, like climate change or poverty?
It's a tough question to grapple with, but it's one we can't afford to ignore.
Absolutely. And, speaking of war,
Oh yeah, let's talk about war. Because again, it might surprise some people to hear this, but statistically, we're living in the most peaceful era in human history.
that's what Harari argues in Sapiens, and there's a lot of data to back it up. Of course, with everything going on in the world, it doesn't always feel that way.
No,
Yeah.
it definitely doesn't. But what if the nature of war itself has changed? Harari makes this point that the economics of war have shifted. In the past, conquering territory often meant gaining access to valuable resources like gold mines, fertile land, or even slave labor. You
Yeah.
could loot conquered cities and enrich your empire.
Yeah, you could literally steal wealth,
Right. But today, the most valuable assets are knowledge and technology.
which you can't just plunder on a battlefield.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So is that old model of conquest and plunder, is it just not a viable economic strategy anymore?
It's becoming less and less so. In a world dominated by information and innovation, conquering territory doesn't automatically translate into wealth and power. Look at China, for example. They've become this global superpower, not through military conquest, but through economic prowess. Building factories, investing in infrastructure, and dominating global trade.
It's almost like you used to need armies to build an empire. But China is showing us you can do it with factories and shipping containers.
It's a fascinating shift. And then there's the whole issue of nuclear weapons. Total victory in a nuclear war is practically impossible.
Right. It's mutually assured destruction.
Exactly. You end up destroying the very thing you're fighting for.
So in a way, nuclear weapons have almost made large-scale war this losing proposition for everyone involved.
It's a sobering thought. But even with these economic and technological shifts, there's always the wild card of human stupidity. As Harari reminds us, despite all the rational arguments against war, we can't discount the power of ideology, national pride, or just plain miscalculation.
Oh, totally. History is full of examples where leaders made disastrous decisions based on emotion rather than logic, like Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor.
A move that ultimately backfired spectacularly.
Yeah. So while we can be cautiously optimistic about this maybe decline in the profitability of war, we definitely can't afford to be complacent. Human nature hasn't changed that much.
Nope. We're still capable of making some pretty terrible choices.
Okay, so we've explored the psychology of terrorism and this changing nature of war. Now let's dive into our final topic for this deep dive, secularism. It's often defined in this very simplistic way, separation of church and state. But Harari, he presents a much more nuanced perspective.
Yeah, he really pushes us to go beyond that simple negative definition of secularism as just the absence of religion,
He digs into the positive aspects,
describing it as a commitment to truth, compassion, and equality.
and it's based on reason and evidence rather than blind faith.
It's not just about rejecting religious belief. It's about finding common ground based on what we can observe and verify.
To illustrate this point, Harari compares the approaches of Emperor Ashoka in ancient India and the Roman Emperor Theodosius.
Two very different leaders with very different philosophies.
Right. So Ashoka, he embraced tolerance and interfaith dialogue. He encouraged different religious communities to live together peacefully.
Whereas Theodosius, he opted for forced conversions and the suppression of pagan religions. He saw religious uniformity as essential for maintaining order in the Roman Empire,
Two very different approaches to religious diversity.
reflecting the values of their time.
And it makes you think, right? Because even secular movements can fall into dogmatism,
Oh, absolutely.
just like religious ones. Harari uses examples like Stalinism, where this secular ideology was enforced with the same zealotry and brutality as any religious crusade.
It's a reminder that no belief system, whether religious or secular, is immune to the dangers of dogma and intolerance.
We all have blind spots. We all have our biases.
It's about being critical of all belief systems, constantly examining our own assumptions, and being open to different perspectives. That's the real challenge.
And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this first part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much more to explore.
There is. In the next part, we're going to delve deeper into the world of modern terrorism and its intricate connection with finance. So stay tuned.
We'll be right back.
So welcome back. Let's shift gears now, okay? Let's dive into this whole world of terrorist financing, because it gets really interesting when you start to look at how these organizations actually get the money to operate.
It is, and it's easy to kind of fall into this trap of imagining terrorist groups as these shadowy organizations with like unlimited funds.
Yeah.
But the reality is often much more complicated.
Yeah, it's not always like some Bond villain with a Swiss bank account.
Right, exactly.
Take ISIS, for example. At its peak back in 2015, it was practically operating like a mini-state, pulling in an estimated $2 billion annually.
$2 billion. I mean, where's all that money coming from?
Well, surprisingly, a huge chunk of it, almost half, came from something really mundane: oil smuggling.
Oil smuggling.
Really? Yeah. They controlled these vast oil fields in Syria and Iraq, and they were pumping out an estimated 75,000 barrels per day.
Wow, so they basically built this like mini oil empire to bankroll their activities.
Exactly. They became this weird hybrid of a terrorist group and an energy company. But that reliance on oil, it also made them vulnerable. Once the global coalition and Iraqi forces started targeting their oil infrastructure and their cash storage sites, their revenue took a major hit. By 2017, their monthly income had plummeted from $81 million to just $16 million.
It's a huge drop. So it seems like cutting off their financial lifelines was actually a key factor in their decline.
Absolutely. But the World Economic Forum article, it highlights this worrying trend, too, the shift towards low-cost, self-funded attacks. Remember the 9/11 attacks? Those were incredibly sophisticated, and al-Qaeda spent an estimated $500,000 on planning and execution.
And now we're seeing attacks that are carried out with far less money, sometimes just a few $1,000s or even less.
Right. It's almost unbelievable that you can inflict so much damage with such limited resources.
It is. I mean, think about the Madrid train bombings, the attempted London car bombs, even that foil attack in Cologne, all tragically effective but relatively inexpensive to carry out.
And then you've got the more recent attacks using vehicles like the one in Nice. It's terrifying to think that something as simple as a truck can be weaponized with such devastating consequences.
Right. And because those attacks are so low cost, they're much harder to detect and prevent. If someone is using their own savings or getting small donations, it's not going to raise the same red flags as large-scale, money transfers. So we're dealing with a new breed of terrorism now,
Hmm.
more decentralized, harder to predict, and often fueled by individual motivations.
Exactly. And this is where Harari's insights about human psychology become really relevant. Remember that empty jar analogy? A small act of violence in a peaceful society, it can have this huge psychological impact, even if it wasn't backed by vast sums of money.
Right, it's about the fear and the disruption.
Mhm.
It's about shattering that sense of security.
Exactly. So how do we address this? We need to start thinking beyond just cutting off financial flows. We need to
Mhm.
understand the motivations that actually drive people to extremism.
Because if we don't understand the root causes, how can we ever hope to prevent it?
Right. And the article cites some really interesting research on this. For example, one study found that over half of former extremists in Africa joined these groups because they felt like their religion was under attack.
And there was another study of al-Shabaab members in Kenya, and it found that almost all of them believed that their religion was being threatened. And many of them actually joined in direct response to the government's counterterrorism tactics.
It's tragic, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
The more we focus on these security measures and these military responses, the more we risk alienating vulnerable communities and actually pushing them towards extremism,
So we have to be really careful about how we approach these issues. It's not as simple as just cracking down harder.
right? It's almost like sometimes the toughest fight is the one we have within ourselves,
Hmm.
you know, breaking free from those cycles of fear and prejudice.
That's a powerful insight. It's about recognizing our shared humanity, even when it's difficult. And the article also emphasizes the importance of addressing things like economic inequality and social mobility. When people feel like their expectations are frustrated, when they feel like the system is rigged against them.
They were more susceptible to these extremist ideologies that offer a sense of purpose or belonging.
Exactly. It's about creating a more just and equitable world where everyone feels like they have a stake. And this is where those secular values, that commitment to truth, compassion, and equality, they can play such a vital role.
It's about building bridges instead of walls. It's about fostering dialogue and understanding. Even in the face of fear and uncertainty, I really believe there's always hope.
I agree with that. But it's crucial to acknowledge the complexities of these issues. It's not about simple solutions or easy answers. It's about engaging in these tough conversations, challenging our own assumptions, and working together to create a better future.
Speaking of tough conversations, let's circle back to Harari's discussion of secularism and explore some of its potential pitfalls. What are your thoughts on that? So we've talked about how secularism can be this positive force, pushing for truth, compassion, and equality. But Harari also warns us about the dangers of secular movements becoming dogmatic. How can a system that values critical thinking fall into this trap of rigid beliefs?
It is a bit of a paradox, isn't it? I mean, you advocate for open-mindedness and questioning everything, but then you can end up clinging to certain beliefs just as fervently as any religious zealot.
It's like that saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Exactly. And Harari, he uses this example of human rights to kind of illustrate this point. It's been this incredibly powerful force for good, protecting the vulnerable, challenging, oppressive systems. But what happens when technology starts to blur the lines of what it even means to be human?
That's a great question. Like, if we have the right to life, does that mean we should use biotech to, overcome death? What about the right to liberty in a world where algorithms might know our desires better than we do?
Or what if we create these superhumans or AI that surpass human intelligence? Are they entitled to the same rights?
It's mind-blowing. It's almost like the concept of human rights, which was so essential in fighting the injustices of the past, might not be equipped to deal with the ethical dilemmas of the future.
And that's where the potential for dogma creeps in. We can become so attached to our current understanding of human rights that we resist adapting to new realities. We dig in our heels and refuse to budge, even when the world around us is changing rapidly.
So how do we avoid that? How do we make sure that secularism remains a force for progress, even as the world is constantly evolving?
Well, Harari suggests that secularism at its best should be about embracing complexity, questioning our assumptions, and being willing to constantly revise our understanding of the world as new information emerges.
So it's about humility.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Recognizing that we don't have all the answers and that our current understanding might be incomplete or even flawed. And this is where science, with its emphasis on testing, revising, self-correction, can be such a powerful ally. It's not about claiming to have the absolute truth, but about constantly refining our models and theories based on evidence.
So it's like applying the scientific method to our own beliefs, constantly testing them against new information and being open to changing our minds when we're proven wrong.
Precisely. And it requires a certain level of intellectual humility, a willingness to admit when we're wrong and to actually change our minds, which can be really tough for people. Our egos tend to get in the way.
They do. Well, this has been quite a journey. We've explored the fear-driven theater of terrorism, the shifting economics of war, and the potential pitfalls of secularism. It's a lot to process.
It is. It can feel overwhelming at times, all these complex issues that impact us all. But I really believe that a deeper understanding is the first step towards meaningful action. Knowledge is power, as they say.
So what does this all mean for us? How do we navigate a world grappling with these challenges? What can we as individuals actually do to make a difference?
Those are the questions we all need to be asking ourselves, and there are no easy answers. But if I can leave you with one final thought, it would be this. In this era of such rapid technological advancement, where the very definition of humanity is being challenged, it's more important than ever to hold on to those core values of truth, compassion, and equality. How do we ensure that those values remain at the heart of our individual and collective choices? That's something worth thinking about, a conversation we need to keep having.
It is. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. Keep questioning, keep learning, and let's all work together to create a better future. Thanks for listening.